we have developed our methodology versus the opinion mainstream? Well, as you said before, we are GIASP, the leading consultancy firm in Spain, specialized in strategic foresight in terms of both production, training, and corporate units implementation. But in order to avoid any misleading understanding of the methodology, we should define clearly what strategic foresight is and means. It was born as an extremely accurate and powerful tool in intelligence agencies. It's a systematic analysis methodology that draws on a vast array of intelligence sources, always in complex environments. This technique allows us to foresee possible futures and create the desired ones. This robust practice leads to counterintuitive results that arise from collective reflections based on key indicators and relevant evidence. The strategic foresight always closes with feasible hypotheses and a final assessment. At the end, the most powerful outcome is linking foresight with policy making. But let's start globally with the results for LAC as the result of the structure analysis applied in the studio. Common key indicators in LAC, it seems likely to face turbulence ahead in the years to come. The USA and other traditional markets tend to lose participation in LAC total exports over the next 15 years. And this trend will continue. Democratic governance is strongly declining in political rights, policies, and civil liberties. There is a strong and growing interconnection among political movements and key strategic Chinese projects. And there is also privatization of major assets, focusing in infrastructures and electricity. LAC has become and will reinforce its position in the Chinese geostrategy because of the need of greater domestic energy, food security, and strategical and critical raw materials in this sector in open competition with the European Union and the USA. China trade is expected to exceed $7 billion by 2035, despite the pandemic, and between 2000 and 2020, China-LAC trade grew 26-fold, from 12 billion to 350 billion. In 2000, Chinese participation accounted for less than 2% of LAC total trade, and in 2035, it could reach 25%. The future, I'm afraid, does not look promising for intra-LAC trade, and due to poor and corrupt internal policies. There's a need to develop new alternative markets for traditional exports, such as agricultural and increasingly strategic raw materials. And, very important, need to tackle the competitivity of export sectors, as there will be a growing imbalance between Chinese imports and local exports. But let's go to Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. All of them are study cases by their own right. We are going to give 3 key indicators for each country. The first for Argentina is that being Argentina, the Chinese Trojan horse for LATAM, the first point is the state structure, an instrumental state at the service of the Peronist party. That means political alignment, economical dependence, and a web of business relationships involving their leaders. The second point is that Argentina is offering China through benefits the easiest access to the market that no other populist or non-populist regime could match. That means the reach and grip of substantial natural resources and strategic raw materials, agricultural inputs to feed 1.4 million Chinese through the Pampas, a substantial middle-class market able to purchase high value-added Chinese goods and services, Argentina-Mercosur membership, that means access to even larger markets in the region, a diversified economy, which includes sophisticated manufacturing, services, and technology sectors, with Chinese-based firms can partner to absorb technologies and refine their products and services. And the third point is Argentinian inability or strong difficulties to obtain funds in the international market due to a lack of trust and a chronic and structural crisis. Let's go to Brazil as, let's say, convenience marriage with China, although a rocky relationship. The first key indicator in Brazil is his change in foreign policy and the meaning of Brazil as one of the BRICS members. By 2017, over half of China's investment in South America were destined to Brazil. Brazil global programs, not least of which because it tends to shift the global economic center of gravity away from the United States. The second point is persistent failure in his industrial policy, which among other factors has contributed to the deindustrialization of its economy and a loss of well-paying formal sector jobs. This is in part due to competition from cheap Chinese manufactured imports. The Brazilian industrial sector, traditionally able to rely on a large domestic market, has favored protectionist policies historically and is not fully competitive globally. On the other hand, agricultural export interests favor and will a strong relationship with Beijing because China is a major market for the products. And the last point is a quite interesting one, which is that the USA and Brazil economic interests, unfortunately, are not aligned. In many important agricultural and mineral commodity export markets, their economies are not complementary, but rather in competition. The Uruguayan path, or how Uruguay is dealing with this situation, is how to make the most of the opportunities provided by China. The first key indicator is that the country has strong democratic institutions and a good relationship with the USA. At the same time, they keep transparency and pragmatism with China. Point number two is due to his OBOR membership, a potential Chinese influence is worth to be monitored in security, agricultural, telecommunications, and health tech sector. And the last point is that Uruguay has clearly said yes to trade, intensive trade, but is quite skeptical towards investments. So that leads us to our final assessment concerning the LAC region. We do highly recommend, first point, through credits and leases from international institutions, they should monitor the regulatory reforms and control their practices to promote business developments and enhance transparency. Another interesting assessment that we think it's quite necessary is a strong support to the democratic governments in LAC. And the last point is that the US Foreign Department should rethink or review their strategy on LAC, because the new rules of the game are not just economic, but mainly political, and affecting directly not only international trade, but the US security issues. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Coronada. Thanks a lot for this assessment and for these strategic scenarios. I do note a couple of things that we will probably go back to later on in the Q&A, which is what you've talked about in terms of political alignments, but also, and especially in the case of Brazil, the issue of what economists call the middle income trap, and how this fact that Brazil has fallen into this middle income trap is creating a kind of economic dependency and a problem of a forced alignment on China. So this is definitely something that we will go back into in the Q&A session. Okay, moving on to the second speaker, Paul Cobaugh in the US, who will be telling us about narrative strategies. Paul is a retired US Army warrant officer with a distinguished career in the US Special Operations counterterrorism community, primarily focused on mitigating adversarial influence. Throughout his career, he has focused on the centrality of influence in modern conflict, whether from extremist organizations or state actors, which is mostly what we will be talking about today. He's now a vice president at Narrative Strategies, a US-based think, do tank, specializing in the non-kinetic aspects of conflicts. He has co-authored, among other books, Soft Power on Hard Problems, Introduction to Narrative Warfare, a primer and study guide, and Countering Violent Extremism. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. And then before I begin, I would really like to offer my deepest gratitude to you, Asia Power Watch, Dr. Malena, and the university. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be presenting alongside such esteemed fellow presenters. So thank you very much. I may not be quite as eloquent as Coronada, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So, what I'm going to talk to you about is something that I don't think let's put it this way. The majority of the world talks a lot about narrative, but it's my opinion and that in our think tank that I don't think we all understand well quite exactly what narrative is. So as I go through my presentation, we're going to learn a little bit about narrative. We're going to learn a lot about Chinese narrative because they're the elephant in the room, so to speak. And we'll talk a little bit about India, Japan. I'll briefly mention Russia, and I'll include the US in there because we're a competitor as well, and probably the one that China is most worried about. So from there, I don't have to tell you who I am and where I come from because Nicolas did such a fine and esteemed job at that. So as Coronado was saying before, current trends in global security revolve around what they now call, all the new terms are hybrid warfare, gray zone conflict. To be honest, whatever name it comes up with, it's exactly what Coronado mentioned before. It's soft power. Now, I would suggest that China's soft power also comes with a bite. So it's more than just soft power. They lean heavily and and as we'll get into a little bit later, I'll tell you what the three defining factors are, and they very much run the same as the last speaker. So let's see, I'm going to try to shorten my remarks because I was planning originally for 30 and I prefer the 20, so off we go. In the remaining time, like I told you, we're going to talk about the meaning of Chinese narrative, because unless you understand narrative principles, it's almost impossible to divine the true intent of a speaker. In the Western world, we tend to listen to words and act based on what people say. Well, a lot of the world, people evaluate actions relative to words. And this is how we get to where narrative is really important. Because if you look back at a nation, a person, a tribe, it doesn't, even an organization, and follow their history and track their behavior, their predictive trends become actually readily apparent. And in any good strategy, you cannot deal with a competitor, an adversary, or anything else unless you know where they're going and how they plan to get there. Because without that, you cannot develop your own strategy accurately or effectively. All influence, the reason I focus on influence, because I drive the US military crazy now that I don't have to follow orders. I like to tell them that even in a shooting war, everything is about influence. Because even if you shoot at someone, you're trying to get them to change where they are, give up, or change something to your advantage or their advantage. Everything is about influence. In the conflicts we've seen in the world over the last, I'd say the majority of the past 40 years have been almost exclusively about influence with a lot less on kinetic conflict. And so that's the good news. The bad news is some nations like China and Russia in particular are predatory in their way that they approach influence. That's a threat not only to economics, but it's a threat to national security, national cohesion, anything that can degrade a unified ethical government. China and Russia will undermine for their own specific purposes. And I'll be honest, I mean, I have nothing against Chinese people, but they are pawns in this. And what I'm going to explain to you next is after about 3 years of at least 50% of my time, maybe 4 actually, I've spent looking at China's history going back 4,000 years. As I mentioned before, trends, predictive trends, literally will leap off the pages of history if you follow them closely. So after 3 or 4 years of study, all I've managed to come up with as a solution is one paragraph. And I was pleased to know that my colleague Coronada actually has already mentioned one of them. So the paragraph is, and let's think about this. The world, this is China's narrative, in my opinion. The world, all under heaven, is one with China, the Middle Kingdom. At the center and at the pinnacle of that kingdom sits one person and one person only, an emperor, or as the Chinese prefer, historically, the Son of Heaven, who is the only single interface with heaven for all the earth. Chinese, as Han Chinese exclusively, which goes to all the human rights issues that we see in China today, everybody has to be Chinese and everybody has to be Han to be in the Middle Kingdom. They are the only enlightened ones in Chinese narrative. Everybody else, literally everyone else in the world, needs to seek a tributary relationship with China in support of what China or the Son of Heaven's intentions are. Because everybody outside of the Han Chinese are barbarians in the classic Chinese narrative. So every nation on the planet, if she gets his way, will be seeking a tributary status with China and to seek to ask the Han to become enlightened like they are. So we will no longer be barbarians. Well, I don't blame this a lot on the Chinese people because they are being manipulated as well with Xi's narratives at home. Because a complete narrative strategy deals with all the issues that you need to influence at one time, simultaneously and on all fronts. It may not be the exact same thing, but it's all towards the intended goal or the objective. In Xi's world, his objective is regional hegemony by 2035 and global hegemony by 2049, the 100th centenary of the Chinese Communist Party. Let's talk just for a second about the Chinese Communist Party. About a little over 2,000 years ago, I think, let's say 2,221 to be exact, the first Han Emperor came to rule in China in the first real, typically what we would consider a unified kingdom or dynasty. Along with him, he brought a new idea called legalism, which had been floating around China for a few hundred years at that point. And it's a system of administrative governance that tolerates pretty much anything as long as the emperor's needs are being met. The CTP, in whatever name they want or go by now, certainly is not communist. It's not really socialist. They are just the modern version of legalism that she has put in place to manage the day-to-day business of China. One interesting note that goes along with this narrative is that when legalism first reared its head in China, it was effective, but it was effective very brutally. And that goes to China's narrative now that one of their defining characteristics is absolute abuse of human rights, or the willingness with their BRI partners to look the other way when there is abuse, human rights issues, or an oppressive government in general. Because again, the tributary requirement to do business with China is to provide for the emperor what he wants. So China will ignore any human rights abuse as long as they're getting whatever they want. And anything that they fund, they'll have an expectation that person will provide for them. So I would like to let's announce right now the 3 points that define the Chinese narrative to the world in their quest for world domination. One, as Coronado mentioned, it's predatory economics. Without a doubt, China will leverage in any way, shape, or form and in ambiguous contracting anything that will give them the opportunity to exercise leverage over a nation, a corporation, infrastructure projects, whatever it is. There's no holds barred for Mr. Xi and his so-called wolf warrior diplomats. Let's see, the third point is, because we have predatory economics, human rights abuse, and this is the one that's subtle in Latin America, but it's very pronounced in Southeast Asia and Central Asia, and South Asia, as a matter of fact. That's military intimidation. The amount of money that Xi is spending on his military right now is frankly enormous by Chinese standards. It pales in comparison to the US and some other nations, but frankly, when you control industry and you control everything about your world, it's easy to spend everything that people have. The only people, and this is another connection to the old legalist entity, the other issue is corruption. She only pulls out the corruption card and plays it when he needs to get rid of a competitor. He will find some scapegoat for something that went wrong, announce that that person's corrupt, they get whisked off to prison, and she gets his way, takes over the industry, takes over the effort, the infrastructure, or whatever it is, because everything belongs to him. He doesn't see it as belonging to China. He sees it as him as the son of heaven, the exclusive emperor. It's his elements of power that he will wield any way he sees fit. So I need to tell you a little bit of, for a second, I need to tell you a little bit how narrative works. Narrative is the way human beings from the very first person experienced the developed meaning between their ears. Human beings will see everything that happens to them in their daily life and they'll stick it in their head, but they will only be experienced as random events if there wasn't a process called narrative. Narrative is the way that we associate meaning to what we experience. What that means also is that every single person has their own unique worldview, and identity would be a better way to look at it. So we all see the world, even identical twins, just a little bit differently because we're all going to have, even identical twins will have slightly different experiences, especially by adulthood. Then you will also get into the fact that people in different nations or different parts of the world, or even in the same nation that are different ethnic groups, religious groups, they all have their own unique narrative identity. So they see the world as a group very similarly. also of interest in the Chinese narrative, what makes it so threatening is, and this is the wall that he's pulling over the Chinese citizens' eyes, is that he's building this rejuvenation of Han Enlightenment, which basically is it's national pride. National pride keeps the people at home happy as long as they're doing well. They have that middle class, that they're not suffering in the countryside they were under Mao. But let's see, I forgot where I was going to go with that. So, okay, I'll come back to it. So the other issue I want you to take away from just understanding narrative is that the point is to establish meaning. If you're going to compete in an influence campaign, which we all do, doesn't matter if it's a corporate marketing strategy or the military going to war, there's always a strategy. That strategy, the intent of that strategy is only uncovered in the narrative of that strategy. Some people develop it better, some people develop it worse. Frankly, the US government has a terrible understanding of narrative as the center of all campaigning. Because everything we do as a nation, or everything that an association like a CN or the Quad, they all have their own unique identity. India is playing very hard in Latin America, as they are, especially in their own region. India harbors the ambition of being a regional hegemon, but they do it mostly out of security. So this goes to the intent between China, India, Japan, the US, and others. The intent of all the other nations that pale in scale compared to the BRI efforts, they are seeking collective action in order to mitigate China's influence campaign around the world, their narrative-centric influence campaign. And that is going to be one of the strengths that China can't overcome, in my opinion. And it goes to, I'm trying to think of an easy way to say this. 1 second, please. I'm trying to come back to a point. So India, Japan, the Quad in general, all the NATO nations that operate in Southeast Asia and South Asia and the South China Sea, we're not going to match China step for step militarily in the region. Nobody can afford that. And at the end of the day, nobody wants to go to war. None of this is worth going to war for. The collective narrative of nations opposing the way China is trying to take over the world, essentially, is that their intent is to turn us into the subservient globe, only to the emperor's needs. The intent is derived from India, Japan, and our narrative is that collective actions not only mitigate Chinese behavior, but what they mitigate are the negative aspects of China's behavior. The world, let's face it, has a symbiotic relationship with China. We don't want to destroy China. We just want them to stop operating absent morals, ethics, values. So the answer is, and this is something else that Coronado implied, or I think you said it directly, is that the answer is a stronger rules-based international order that operates as much as possible towards equitability between nations, organizations, business, or otherwise. Because within a nation or within a region, it's all related. It doesn't matter if you're Microsoft or Apple, your impact is regional, and you have to have a regional strategy as well as a global strategy in order to operate. China will prey on that. That's why they steal intellectual property, and they have not diminished that, and we all know that. They will not stop doing things like taking ports away from Sri Lanka because they couldn't pay back the loan or couldn't meet the terms of the loan, which were ambiguous in the first place. So China is coming for us. That intent cannot be denied any longer. They've made it extremely clear. And that was mostly made clear by the fact that they operated so aggressively during our last administration when we weren't paying attention. America First does not support, as a concept, does not support collective activity around the world to mitigate threats. The only thing that will mitigate threats like China and a receding Russia is collective action, rules-based order, equitability, and ethics. And even though I had a lot more I wanted to tell you about, I think this is going to be so interesting to hear from all four of us. I would like to shut my part down now and hand it off to the next speaker in the interest of hearing what everybody else has to say. And then we'll come back to this, I think, later on, as Nicolas and Jorge have mentioned. Thank you. And thank you, Coronado, for setting everything up nicely, just for me.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for this presentation. I think two of the takeaways, at least for me, that we will probably go back to in the Q&A are what we would call the cynicization of relationships, and also what you've told about predatory economics, which goes back into the debt trap diplomacy narrative, which is also a narrative. I mean, a lot has been written about economists about the fact that debt trap diplomacy in many cases does not necessarily qualify as such. So it is also a narrative, and it would be interesting, I think, in the Q&A to confront narratives and counter narratives in that sense. I think Jorge should be introducing the next speaker now.
All right, thanks, Nicolas. Now is the turn for Simon Felix Taeuber, who is a doctoral candidate in international relations and a fellow of the Center for Global Law and Governance at the University of St. Andrews, where he also teaches on several modules. Professor Taeuber is a scholar in the foundation of the German Episcopal Conference. Since the year 2021, he's also a visiting researcher at the Argentine Catholic University. His main areas of interest and research include Sino-European and Sino-Latin American relations, in particular the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative. He holds a master's degree in global studies from Roskilde University in Denmark and a BA in international business from Baden-Württemberg Cooperative State University in Germany. His work on norm contestation and Sino-European relations has been published in Cooperation and Conflict, the Journal of Rising Powers and Global Governance, and the Air Force Journals of European, Middle Eastern, and African Affairs. Professor Taeuber won the Critical Edge Alliance's Best Student Paper Award in the year 2018 and has presented his research at numerous international conferences. The topic of his presentation today is Sailing the Indo-Pacific on the Belt and Road Initiative, China and Latin American Contemporary Relations. Professor Taeuber, the floor is yours.
Professor Malena, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much to UCA and Asia Power for the invitation. And thank you also to my co-panelists for their contributions already and for the other one we're hearing after mine today. As introduced, my interest lies with order, or well, actually with disorder, and how we as humans in different polities then construct order from the same. At present, Latin America and the Caribbean as a region entirely, and its relations with China are at the heart of my investigations. And that's really what gets me up in the morning. That and Colombian coffee beans and a coarse grind, of course. How I came to the topic of the Belt and Road Initiative comes through two lanes. One is a research project on EU-China relations. The other swim lane, so to speak, is I've been fortunate enough to live in China, work in China in the past. I spent time in central China training martial arts after high school. And I've also been able to spend some time in Latin America. So for me, these two parts of the world coming together through the Belt and Road Initiative, arguably coming together are a combination which I love to engage myself in discussions and conversations like today. Before I dive into my presentation today, I would like to briefly address my own positionality. regarding the subject at hand, and more generally, as a white male born in Europe, raised within a European Australian family, having received my education in Europe, I am by all means from the north, and I'm coming to the topic. As an outsider. I'm coming to the regions as an outsider. That means this privilege needs to be addressed, as I'm now doing. And I need to, in my research, take care that I give credit to the perceptions of those from and of the region, meaning that my research is based in the thoughts and ideas of statespersons from the PRC, from Latin American countries, and international organizations too. In pandemic times, my research, like most of us, has become geographically distant from the places that we engage ourselves in and that we study. At the same time, we're fortunate enough to have the tech available to do interviews, to do sessions like we are today in this format. I want to use my time today to take you on a brief journey, how I first started studying the BRI, how I came to some conclusions about what it is, what it could be, what it might be in the future, and also share some insights for Latin America, some open questions which I haven't found answers to, and I would love to discuss in the open Q&A session later on. Before I start with my presentation, I first need to share it, I believe. Let's see if that works. So here we are. Yes, let me start with my research framework. And this ties in nicely with what Paul was just presenting, because I try to study disorder and order and what scholars call normative fabric. For myself, I have a preconception, which is a concept out of international relations called international society, which comes out of a group of scholars, a scholarship called the English School, and an international society there globally and in regions is, in a nutshell, can consider the group of states conscious of certain common interests and common values. Now, there's not just one international society, there are many. So how do we study such international societies? How can we study order? How does it exist? For me, that's my approach to it. I study the thoughts and ideas that we have as humans, and in particular, the statespersons of the context that I study have, meaning they express themselves in discourse. And from that discourse, there's a linkage to thought, which I would like to illustrate with an example most of you, or many of you might know, which is from one of my favorite books. It is when Bilbo said, "Good morning," and Gandalf responded, "What do you mean?" And that question, what do you mean, goes back to what Paul also said earlier about narratives. Just because it's written in one way doesn't mean that there is only one meaning. There could be multiple meanings to it. There's a multiplicity involved in that. And in this case, Bilbo meant all of them, and he would like some tobacco as well on top. This ties in scholarly terms to, for me at least, to Wittgensteinian philosophy of language and the sense of meaning in use, so that the meaning intended by a speaker can be studied and understood from how words, metaphors, framing are used in discourse. That, in general, is my approach to how I study international relations between the EU, China, or the PRC, in Latin America, in the region, and beyond. Now, I'm quickly going to go through some visuals. We heard a lot about the BRI already, and I'm sure most of you are familiar. There are three main routes when it first started out: land-based and maritime through the Eurasian continent, touching Africa, touching Southeast Asia and Oceania. Now, also, we've heard about the main pillars of the BRI earlier when Coronado was introducing them also. And there are two main organizations affiliated with the BRI as a framework for, well, cross-regional cooperation. What we can see from this map on the right-hand side, the BRI is material to some extent. There is a lot of infrastructure going on in that part of the world currently. There is a lot of lending going on. There are organizations that parallel some organizations we have had in, say, a northern dominated or hegemonic order in the past. But it does go beyond that, because if we look at how the BRI came to Europe, and the link to Latin America will come in a second, we can see that it came gradually, but it came very quickly. And suddenly, a good part of Europe, not just the EU, was affiliated with the BRI as a political framework. In some countries, there was a material aspect to it, but pairing this with what I said earlier, I took interest in the BRI because of the political and ideational aspects of it, simply because you can see there's a clear blue cordon, so to speak, that restrained from membership or stayed away from membership there. Now, there's been a lot of contestation between the EU in terms of narratives, calling the PRC a competitor, a rival, a systemic rival, and I think this is where we really get to the main friction. It is a competition of different systems, of different conceptions of order, economic order, but also political order. As a brief summary here, my research thus far makes me conclude that the BRI is indeed intentionally a normative framework, not just something for cooperation and building infrastructure, but definitely something that has a normative aspect. This is acknowledged also by actors outside of traditional political realms. For example, Joe Kaeser, CEO of Siemens, called OBOR, BRI, the new WTO. For those familiar with decades of discussion between the WTO member states and China, market economy status has been a huge contention in that sense. Another aspect, and this is where we get to the linkage to Latin America, the first members to join the BRI from Latin America and the Caribbean switched their diplomatic relations from the Republic of China to the PRC. And I think this shows that there is much movement in the political sector and relations beyond economic relations, trade and exchange. If we go further, in 2017, Xi Jinping started talking about Latin America in the context of the BRI. The continent or the region was labeled as an indispensable and important participant of the BRI, even though at that point, only Panama had just signed an MOU. And you can see, and we go back to strategies also, sorry, the narratives also, that there is the normative element in the second highlighted part that both sides, the PRC and Panama in this case, should strengthen the docking of development strategies. This might hopefully make more sense in a moment. Just keep in mind the docking of the development strategies is here in plural. If we go to the unfolding of the BRI subsequently in Latin America, following year at the China CELAC summit, the foreign minister for the PRC made a stronger statement, which is along his normal line of discourse, that countries from the region cannot be absent. But there was another thing which really is a discursive construction, which goes back to narratives also, the narrative of an ancient maritime Silk Road across the Indo-Pacific. Now, we all learn that the Silk Road went from China westwards, and that's also when we read the Chinese classics, where we learn about the stories about it. We learn about Marco Polo, and we learn about the journey to the west from the Chinese perspective also. But the idea that Foreign Minister Wang brought forward here to revitalize a maritime Silk Road across the Indo-Pacific struck me as odd. I thought it was ingenious, but it struck me as odd because I, in my education, had not heard about it. And going back many, many hundreds of years, those sailing the Indo-Pacific or the Pacific were the Pacific nations or island nations in that sense. If we quickly take a look at the trajectory of BRI affiliations and how relations warmed up between the region and the PRC, started off with preparatory meetings for the founding of CELAC, but also the China-CELAC Forum in the mid-2010s. And by the end of the 2010s and 2020, the image looked somewhat like that. In yellow, you can see affiliations with the BRI on a political level by MOU. The majority of the Caribbean and South American continent, in that sense, had affiliated on the political level. That does not mean, obviously, that there is the same amount of. Nicolas, how are we on time?
5 minutes left.
Perfect, thank you. That does not mean, however, that there is a similar extent of infrastructure construction in Latin America at this point, compared to Africa, compared to Central Asia, compared to Eastern Europe. There's much more going on in that sense now. The pandemic had a major impact in lending activities and aid activities from the PRC to Latin American countries also. The latest peaks were in 18 and 19, just before the MOUs were signed. What goes on further will have to be seen. But there are, for example, and I'm not going to speak too much about Colombia, it's one of my cases, but we have someone on the ground and from the region to speak about it. But look at Bogota. It is not an American, a European, or a Latin American company constructing the trains in Bogota, but it's a Chinese state-owned company. And Colombia is not aligned with the BRI at this point. So that's the trajectory of the BRI in Latin America. Let me quickly go through a core argument which I'd like to make very speedily, and that is wherever I turn to analyze discourse relating to the BRI, I have come across what I've termed now the civilization difference argument. It's a 3-point recurring theme talking about the difference of civilizations, but also the equality of the same. And as a result, that none can be superior. The conclusion that Xi Jinping makes and other state persons or representatives make is that for these reasons, the application of universal laws and rights cannot be made in all regions. If we translate that to, say, political terms, it is an insistence on absolute sovereignty rather than relative sovereignty relative to international law, to universal human rights. But that is the discursive argument put forward again and again. That becomes clear also when we look at official framings of the BRI and we look at what we saw earlier, different development strategies in the sense of, well, the plural in that part. We can see the multipolar world where the BRI is situated in. And just because of time, go to one of the later statements. We are talking about diversified, independent again, absolute sovereignty, balanced and sustainable development. But China or the PRC is also very clear that the BRI is a Chinese proposal. So it is based on their values and their interpretations of certain institutions and norms. We spoke about economic relations briefly. This is just to illustrate trade reliance in both directions and FDI flow between Latin America and also the PRC. In closing, I'd just like to make 4 short points. One is we must keep in mind that the BRI is both material and economic, but it is also ideational and political. And the normative aspects of it can speed up or hinder any cooperation in the economic sector there too. But even if there's no official political relation, still the economic connections grow faster than we can track them. There are counter initiatives. Economically speaking, EU-Japan have launched a counter initiative to have an alternative to the BRI for Latin America also. For the Pacific, we have AUKUS just recently formed, making headlines now. The closing question which I have for us here today, and maybe we can turn to that in the Q&A, what about Latin America in all of that? So Latin America comes, as Coronada said, from colonial times, dominated by the US. And at the moment, the regional cohesion is fragmented at best. But we have a new actor with massive interest in the region, in the continent. And my question really is, where is Latin America as a region going to find its place? Or is it going to be individual states and actors from Latin America choosing different sides? Example, Chile running naval exercises with the US, while Argentina is buying airplanes in China. And with that, I'd like to yield any remaining time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon, for this presentation. And I gotta say, I'm very happy to see that already the first three speakers have been touching upon like some common topics. I will keep for later this question of political alignment that you, Simon, have talked about, same as Coronada. And I think this all goes back also to the question of narrative that Paul has been discussing before. And I would like to ask to go back to this quote of the dialogue between Bilbo and the wizard. What does China mean when it says to Latin America, good morning? Does it mean that this morning is good whether they like it or not? Or does it mean, as they pretend, that they will work together to make this morning good for everybody's benefit? So I think we can keep that for the Q&A. And Simon, you will be happy because you were itching to talk about Colombia, and now we will be dedicating the next 20 minutes about Colombia. Elena is joining us from Medellin in Colombia. She will be discussing the specific case of Indo-Pacific and most likely about what China has been doing in Colombia. Elena is a partner and director at Asia Intelligence Advisory. She's an economist with over 10 years of experience developing investment, cooperation, and globalization strategies based on data analysis and network dynamics. Previously, she has worked as an investment advisor for Colombia's National Mining Agency, and she has served as an advisor to the Colombian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, focusing on East Asia. She has also taught international economics at Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Bogota, and worked as a consultant and researcher at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Elena, the floor is yours for the next 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Nicolas, and thank you, Jorge, also for this space to discuss those issues. Okay, so today I will be discussing Chinese investment and influence in Colombia. Like all the other speakers, we're talking about general aspects, Belt and Road Initiative, narratives. I'm going to be talking about the specific case of Colombia, but from a network approach. So what I'm going to be talking about is how China gains influence in the country through the FDI process. What I'll be doing is I'll be showing the preliminary results of a study my co-author and I have been working on. So the first thing I want to say is that China's overseas investment dynamics are different from those of other Asian countries like Korea and India, for instance. But today I'm going to be focusing mainly on Chinese dynamics. Oh, wait a minute. I forgot to share the screen. So just give me 1 minute. Okay. Okay, can Nicolas or Jorge confirm if you see the
Yes.
The presentation, please?
Yes,
okay,
we can see the
thank
screen.
you. Okay, thank you. Okay, so, okay, so what I was saying, that Chinese overseas investment is different from that of India or Korea. But today I'm going to be focusing on the Chinese case. And other thing I want to say before I start is what my co-author and I are finding that happens in Colombia. It also happens in other countries in the region. But as I said again, we're going to be focusing in Colombia right now. And right, this case. Okay, so first, here we have a short overview of Chinese investment in Colombia in the past 10 years. So you see, like we went from having $0.7 million in 2010 to having 64.2 million in 2020. So you can see it's a significant increase. And so far, this is data from the central bank. In 2021, the first 6 months of the year, so far, Chinese investment in Colombia has reached $43.5 million. Okay, we can see that it has increased, but if we take in relative terms, Chinese investment in Colombia is still very insignificant if you compare it to countries such as the US, who has always been the biggest investor in the region. And in 2020, US investment in Colombia was $1.95 billion. Spain was $1.81 billion. The Netherlands was $1.1 billion. Switzerland, $770 million, and Panama, $560 million. So although Chinese investment has increased, it's still relatively small if we compare it to big investors in the country. Okay, so it's important to say that Colombia is not part of the Belt and Road Initiative. If the country is going to join, we don't know yet, but so far we're not part of it. We have nothing to do with it. It's also important to know that there are around 80 Chinese companies in Colombia in sectors including gas, mining, infrastructure, energy, transportation, and technology. Here, there is a short list of some of the most emblematic Chinese investments in Colombia. When I say emblematic, I also mean they're the ones that have most media coverage or academic coverage. They're covered on academic papers. So we have China Harbor Engineering Company, who's building the Bogota Metro. Simon mentioned that in our last presentation. China Solar is building clean energy projects. Xinjiang Mining, it's exploring the Colombia's biggest gold mine. I underline Xinjiang Mining because I have been working in the mining sector for many years now. So I'm going to be giving specific examples relating to the mining sector. BYD was providing electric buses, public transportation to the country. Sinopec and Sinochem are involved in oil and gas production, and Huawei, obviously, technology and telecommunications. Okay, so in general, Chinese companies have a mandate from Beijing, as expressed by Savannah Nolan in 2015, that says China encourages the type of outward foreign direct investment that contributes directly to the country's development, especially by obtaining natural resources, promoting exports, or strengthening the country's technological base. So, keeping this in mind, my co-author and I did some research on all the Chinese firms in Colombia in order to find evidence that support the mandate that I just mentioned. So what we found is that Chinese investors in Colombia look for and want to invest in projects that have the following characteristics. They want to invest in strategic sectors and strategic projects, which grant them visibility. As someone who worked from all of the companies we're studying, he said, like, they want visibility. They want to be able to show what they did, their accomplishment. And moreover, they want to say, oh, you know what? This was a mess here. They didn't know how to do it. We came, we made it work, and look how things are running smoothly now. So they want to do strategic sectors, strategic projects that grant visibility. They also look for projects with prospects of expansions. What do I mean here? They want to apply their experience, their know-how in a specific sector in projects in the similar sector or related sectors. This is like very evident in the mining industry, as we will see later. They work on a project, but they are also looking for more projects where they can apply this know-how. And also they want, and I think this is the most important aspect of our study, is that they look for projects that allow for the creation of new value and supply chains with Chinese companies at the center. Again, I'm gonna throw back from the mining sector. There's a whole dynamic that involves uniforms, machinery, raw materials, technology, and the companies want all this to be provided by Chinese firms. But it's not only their own supply chain, it also involves related or external supply chains. For instance, mining projects, they're now producing, encouraging the production of coffee in influence areas, and now they are exporting that coffee to China. So you see how they want to be involved in as many supply chains and value chains as possible. So that's our like foundations. Chinese companies investing in Colombia look for projects or invest in projects that are related to strategic sectors, have expansion prospects, and foster the creation of supply and value chains with them at the center. Okay. So the goal of our study was actually to prove that the previous 3A hypotheses hold with actual data. So we did the research, we did the interviews, but we want to know with actual data if that is what Chinese companies look for in Colombia. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, that also holds for other countries, but we're working on the Colombia case right now. And making sure that the data holds is important because it helps us make predictions about what companies might be interested in investing in Colombia. So, and this type of information has already been proven useful, both for origin country, China, and destination countries, Colombia and others. And actually following this principle of investment processes based on aerodynamics, I have already given advice to Chinese companies on what investment opportunities they might find interesting in Colombia. Okay, so now I'm going to talk very briefly about the underlying economic theory and methodology of our work. Don't worry, it will be super short, but I think it's important to mention it. As I said, I work on a network approach. And nowadays, many economic, political, and social interactions are shaped by this local structure of relationship, meaning networks. We will always see networks at play in investment and trade context. How do we see it? Firms collaborate in research and development, firms merge, firms produce joint venture products and ventures, firms contract on specific supply relationships. So firms are always relating to each other, and that's what networks come into play. Additionally, in this context of trade and investment, the network position of a company and the structure matters. So I'm going to show you here something. Why network structure matters. So here I have network A. As you see, the little red dots, we call them nodes. And you see how they're like mostly connected to each other. Like any node can reach any other node by using any of the nodes in between. So that's a fully connected network. But network B is fully connected, but it's much smaller. So why does network structure matter? In a trade investment context, network A will have a much greater impact in the economy overall than network B. The second aspect of a network approach, the position in the network. Node A, the one you see there, the green node, has a central position in the network, and it can easily approach other nodes. So we say that node A has a central position in the network. So we said network A is fully connected and has an impact in the economy, and node A is central and can reach other nodes easily. What am I saying this? Because our research shows that companies, Chinese companies, investment in Colombia, try to create or replicate network structures that resemble network A here. So they want to be part of fully connected networks that have an impact in the economy of the country overall. Additionally, individual Chinese companies, I'm going to call companies nodes, they want to resemble node A here on the left. So each Chinese company wants to be as central as possible and to have the biggest impact it can have. So each company that wants to come to this country, Colombia, and as I said, it can be replicated in other countries, each Chinese company wants to be as central as possible. So they want to replicate network structure A, have an impact overall because of how well connected they are, and each company wants to have as many degrees as possible. Okay, so just a little bit more about networks because it's important to have this in mind. When I talk about a company, I'm going to be talking about companies as nodes, and I'm going to be talking about centrality. And when I say centrality is how connected or how connected a company or a node is. And when I say connected, I refer to the number of links a given node has. So here on the left, you see node 16. You see node 16 is pretty much well connected by one path length or two path lengths to every node in this network. So when I say Chinese want to have a high degree centrality, it means that the Chinese companies investment in Colombia want to be connected to as many nodes as possible. Okay, so now, what projects do the Chinese look for? So in our project, my co-author and I were giving each of these three hypotheses: strategic projects, strategic sectors, expansion prospects, and embedded in supply chains. We're giving them centrality measures. So for strategic projects and strategic sectors, we call this political centrality. For expansion prospects, we call the economic centrality. And how many supply chains Chinese companies are part of, we also call it economic centrality. So translating the hypothesis into network language, we can say that Chinese companies, when investing abroad, look for political centrality, economic centrality in two terms, in terms of expansion and in terms of embeddedness. Okay, so now I just told you that we wanted to measure the three hypotheses in terms of centrality. Now, I am going to show you how we are actually measuring that centrality. So the economic centrality measure, we're using degree centrality of a node. When I talk about nodes, I mean company in supply chains and value chains. So that means a Chinese company that invests in Colombia, how many supply chains or value chains in the country it's part of. And the data shows that is a high number. Another measure we're using is diffusion. So what do we mean by diffusion? To what others and how many similar or related projects could the company potentially expand to? That means using the know-how and experience from a project to use it in another project. And our measure of political centrality means the role of the government in the project. That can be translated into PPP, a private-public partnerships, authorizations, and cooperations. Okay, so our preliminary results show that Chinese investments in Colombia have a very high degree of economic centrality and political centrality. So they're very well connected, both in economic terms or political terms. What does this allow? This allows us to have a clear idea of what is a Chinese target investment in Latin America and the Colombian case specifically. And more importantly, I think it allows us to predict what companies might be actually interested in investment in the region in the future. So it allows us to make predictions. Okay, so I think the most important part of the results is the prediction part. Because if you study what projects are kind of available here and knowing what kind of projects the Chinese are looking for, you can actually start advising the Chinese where they can actually start investment. And that's something I have been doing in the past couple of years. Okay, so
Elena, if you could try and wrap it up within 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, I'm on my last slide. Finally, I wish I could tell you about all the cases we have studied, but I'm going to talk about the mining sector. So the Sijin mining liberty mine. Why is it politically relevant? It's a priority sector for the government. Actually, the government had many reservations about having the Chinese investing in Colombia because the experience of Peru and Chile. There were rumors that they were not being really environmentally friendly. But anyway, the Chinese managed to make it. Now they acquired a Continental Gold mine in Canada they acquired a Continental Gold mine from the Canadians, which is the biggest gold mine in the country, and it has one of the biggest tenors in the world. So, and what happens in the specific case? There is a whole dynamic of supply chains. So the company has their own providers of materials, of uniforms, of machinery. They're all Chinese. They're also creating their own value chains. A mining company is also growing coffee and exporting coffee, but they're a mining company. And finally, they are applying that experience to new mining projects, like the experience they have on this specific mine. They're starting to apply it in other important and strategic mining projects in the country. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Elena, for this very deep presentation of what's going on in Colombia. And I do keep for the Q&A this idea that the Chinese companies in Colombia, but also, as you said, they're trying to replicate that elsewhere, are really seeking political and economic centrality in their strategy of penetration of those countries. Okay, so what we will do now, we have about like 35 minutes left. So we would like to start the Q&A session. So we would like to be taking questions from the audience if you have any. So feel free to send them in writing through the chat box. Maybe to get the discussion going, I would like to start with one of my own that will basically try and get all the speakers involved, because it has been touched upon by pretty much the four of you, and that's the political element of Asian economic involvement in LATAM, and most particularly Chinese economic involvement. Over the past few years, I mean, we have seen in Latin America what has been called in the media a conservative wave. So many governments in Latin America switching from traditionally what could be branded as left-wing governments, many of them switching to more conservative governments. And now it looks like we are on the verge of moving back into much more socialist-leaning governments. I mean, the latest example that we've discussed, Colombia, the next election next year looks like the conservative government might have a very hard time keeping power, and that Gustavo Petro, an ex-guerrilla, seems to be having some pretty good chances of reaching power. So I would like to ask the four of you what your take is on the chances that the political scene in Latin America and the way that it could be changing. I mean, Brazil could be also going back to a more left-leaning type of government after Bolsonaro. What kind of influence, what kind of impact could this have on a scenario for China, but also for other Asian actors that we have talked about less? We've briefly talked about India. Japan is also trying to play a role. Korea is also trying to play a role. So what you guys think that the political landscape could have an impact in terms of where this Asian economic influence is going forward in Latin America? Anyone? Any of you who wants to start?
I'll just jump in maybe. If we look at the political history in Latin America, we've had waves going in different directions. Marea Azul, Marea Roja. So the shift to, as you described it, Nicolas, a shift to a more left-leaning or socialist government, from my perspective, could bring a focus in Latin American countries on South-South cooperation, much more than there is now even. That means between regions, but it also means possibly within the region. So if that left turn or another left turn could manifest, I would see chances of more talks about regional integration of certain aspects of regional governance, rather than regional cooperation across regions or within Latin America and the Caribbean. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you.
That's okay, I'll go next. And Simon, I agree very much so with what you just said. I'd also like to add that a partial dissenting voice, which is, I don't think China, frankly, cares if it's left or right. I think what they care about is a government, is it a government that they can manipulate over the long term? And that's what manipulate with leverage. And I think that the extremes on either left or right are the most easily manipulated, because you can play to the character of the leadership in the party or the movement, or however you want to say it, for each individual country. China is looking for advantage and although that's an oversimplification, is also very accurate. You know, I'll be quiet now and let somebody else continue.
Maybe one addition then, and we should also consider that socialist governments, or socialism in that sense, as we would likely then see it in the left in Latin America, is significantly different from socialism with Chinese characteristics. So even though there is socialism in China, that interpretation of socialism, and there we are again with narratives and with meaning, doesn't mean the same as it meant in the past in Latin America and as it means today. So in terms of system compatibility, I think we still would face, even though there could be a turn to the left, we would still face system compatibility issues in terms of governance and economic market structure in that sense, order.
Agreed.
I completely agree,
Simon.
Simon. Completely agree. And China is not above manipulating indigenous populations or the local populations of a nation to become the type of party that makes them easy to manipulate. For example, we see in the US, like Russia, China manipulates in media as much as they possibly can fringe elements of both sides of the political aisle here in the US to their own advantage. Distractions is diversion is one of the oldest tactics on the battlefield, and it's the same in the corporate boardroom or in international politics. So whoever they can encourage to be fringe or be out there or be populist, there's an advantage to Beijing for that.
But Paul, you have to recognize that in the post-Trump world, the fact that the Biden administration, came in and brought a lot of hope that the America First strategy was going to be over, and the fact that, with the latest AUKUS defense partnership in the Pacific came about, it seems to be sending the message that things may not be that different coming out from Washington. And then my question is, should Latin America, and I'm thinking of Bolsonaro, for example, here, which was really looking up to Donald Trump, how can Latin America now project itself in terms of its own relationship with China versus its relationship with the US?
Cooperation. And the one thing, yes, and I do agree that the submarine deal issue that we've just had between France and Australia, I don't know how that came about, and it's disastrous at the moment, but potentially not as, in the long run, not as bad as it would seem. The one thing that does still lend encouragement to me is our recommitment to the Pacific, number one, and two, the recommitment to diplomacy, as with the president's speech in the UN. I think it was, 2 days ago or 3 days ago, something like that. And there is evidence once that, for example, our State Department has been gutted 30% of its employees over the last, 6 or 7 years. With a lot of that coming in the last administration. Right now, everybody in the State Department is doing one thing. They are processing SIV visas for Afghans that we're extracting from Afghanistan. And they don't have, unfortunately, they don't have time for diplomacy for the most part. But it is, I do know for a fact and for certain that it is the front running effort for the United States, an engagement. And we also, in the US, what we do is in theory, we write a national security strategy every year. Over the last few administrations, it's become one national security strategy per administration. So the new administration has not had time to fully develop theirs yet, but they issued interim guidance back in March for the national security strategy. It is fully committed to engaging in cooperation around the world in pursuit of more equitable commerce, equitable security. So at least it's in writing. We'll see what comes of it, but the questions are valid. That is something to question.
Simon?
Yes, thank you, Nicolas. To your question, what can Latin America do? I think that the younger generations in Latin America and the coming generations need to be very much aware of history, and that the continent or the region is in a peculiar situation now where old hegemonic or colonial structures are in the process of dissolving to a certain extent, and the population and politicians locally need to make a decision now whether to reconstruct similar dependencies in trade relations, in political relations today, even though it might be south-south with China, or whether they would like to take a different route in regional, extra-regional cooperation, or with great powers to that end. And maybe to tie in a quick comment to Ariel's question in the chat, in terms of military or quasi-military alliances in Latin America. Let's not forget that Brazil actually did sign a military cooperation agreement, Bolsonaro did, with China some time ago. It sort of ended nowhere, but initially there was an intent to do these kind of training exercises and cooperations. That has changed and shifted now again, but we already see that. I mentioned it briefly earlier. Chile is running massive naval operations and trainings in the Indo-Pacific with the US already. So if we speak AUKUS, from my perspective, Chile is basically already doing such a quasi-military alliance, or at least on an exercise basis, in the Indo-Pacific.
Absolutely. I think it's pretty clear that AUKUS will be on everybody's mind going forward. If not as a model, of course, it will have direct implications on the Pacific Rim. But as a model itself, there's a big question whether it's something that will be replicated. I would like to get you guys to maybe tell us a little bit more about other Asian powers, because we focused very naturally on China because of the sheer size of it. But I mean, as some of you have briefly mentioned, India is also around. I mean, India has been deploying health diplomacy and vaccine diplomacy pretty effectively. And as far as I know, they've been actually acting as intermediaries between Taiwan and Paraguay, for example. South Korea, Japan, through their official development assistance programs, are also active and present, even if they're probably much more discreet than China is. What can you guys tell us in regards to what those other Asian powers or middle powers are doing in Latin America, and whether they are going in direct confrontation with China, or they're just trying to, maybe just set their own tracks on the ground without ruffling, too many feathers?
Okay, I think I see something here because the same map I'm doing with China. I'm also doing it with India. The case with India is that India looks more for economic centrality than political centrality. So what happens in the COVID scenario? Yeah, they're producing vaccines, but the funny thing is that they can't actually transfer knowledge to produce vaccines in Latin America, but not for COVID, because COVID is already like the technology in the UK and they cannot do it. But what's the problem the Indians are having right now? They need like support and knowledge transfer from other countries that can help them actually get into the vaccine market in Latin America. So they're trying, but they're not quite there yet. But the initiative's there.
Yeah, thank you. Paul?
So yes, just as a quick administrative note, I prepared my remarks in a paper. It's about a 95% completion. I'll finish it up in a couple of days, and I'll send it along because it covers a lot more of this that I did. But I actually talked extemporaneously prior, so I will send
see this.
along.
We will see this on Asia Power Watch very soon then.
Thank you. So I do want to hit though the point you made about India, and actually Japan, because, okay, we'll just go to India because everybody's competing with vaccine diplomacy via their own narrative, but their own narrative about vaccine diplomacy is nested into a meta narrative or a master narrative for the nation. So India, I completely agree with Elena and Simon have already said about India's goal via their narrative is, their current narrative is just regional hegemon status. But that hegemon status in South Asia and Asia, it's not oriented towards aggression, it's oriented towards their own security. Especially over the past, since the Cultural Revolution, they've had threats from China. So India is definitely playing hard in the vaccine world, even had a big announcement of something like 25 million vaccines administered in a day or something about a week and a half ago. So they're playing hard in that role. But I want to talk a little bit about the Japanese narrative because I find it not only fascinating, but appropriate. So Japan, like Australia and Southeast Asia, they both committed something like $400 or $500 million towards infrastructure development as a mitigation tool for Chinese aggression. I find it fascinating that the Japanese have named their campaign Juntos, together. So not only is it together, but it's reinforced by their themes, which are progress together, lead together, and inspire together. So they are trying, from a narrative perspective, to emphasize that we're not going to be a threat to you in any way, shape, or form, economically, militarily, or in any way, shape, or form. What they're trying to say is they just want to be a good commercial partner. And what they bring to the table is they bring alliances that are profitable. Now, Japan, for the first time since World War II, just ventured as far as the Indian Ocean with their Navy, and they're slowly reconstructing the Constitution to support exterior efforts that are non-defensive post-World War II. The other thing that's really interesting about narratives of India and Japan are that because narratives are built by identity, that they're interrelated in a way that you cannot separate. India and Japan both are rebuilding an identity because of their historical identities disappeared in the 40s. Japan, the identity that carried them into World War II is not the identity of Japan that we see today. It's far more diverse, more tolerant. It broke out of it in the 1860s. It broke out of its old samurai code and ventured out. So with post-World War II, they are focusing on the diverse, collective, cooperative, economic strength and what they bring to the table. India, because it was partitioned in 47 with Pakistan, who is still their mortal enemy and supported hand in hand by the Chinese at this point via CPEC, India is also rebuilding their identity. And here's the great irony in the Indian and the Chinese narrative. Modi is employing Xi's tactics in India with extreme xenophobia and I can never pronounce, and I cannot pronounce that word. And my closest partner and colleague in our think tank is Indian. So to my great embarrassment, Hindutra? Okay, so everybody knows what I'm talking about. It's Hindu nationalism. Yeah, so Hindu nationalism is reshaping the identity of India to be exclusively Hindu. So Xi and Modi both are competing with trying to unify around a very central xenophobic idea, the support of the people, a populist support from the people. That way they don't have to worry about what's happening at home while they're out there in expansion globally. I think I went on a little bit longer, so I'll be quiet and let somebody else talk.
I have a question.
Yes.
To all the speakers, how do you foresee the evolution of China's push in Latin America and the Caribbean, considering two factors? First, Washington's refocusing in the Indo-Pacific, which will demand more attention from China. And secondly, the role Beijing will have to play in Central Asia after the Taliban takeover.
Doctor, go ahead, Coronado, I'm sorry.
Coronada, you need to unmute. You need to unmute first.
I think they are quite capable of working these three scenarios together. For them, LATAM is the need, the Communist Party, the need, how can I express this? They need to feed there's a, how can I say? They need to be supported by their own people, being well fed and in a, let's say, comfortable position. So it's Latin America is the pragmatic side of the Communist Party. And the other scenarios, which are political, I think they are quite sure about them. I don't feel there's a danger in holding in a quite an appropriate way.
Thanks, Coronada. Any other speaker would like to add something?
Wow.
Gladly.
Oh, go ahead, please.
No, do you want to go ahead first? Okay. Great question. Thank you very much. Maybe starting with Central Asia or the Afghanistan issue at the moment. I think when we look at Afghanistan and the war and conflict happening there for quite some time, China does and has proven to actually play an important role at the moment with receiving emissaries and diplomats, representatives of the Taliban very early on, as early back as I think it was early July, at least official meetings. So I think there China can play a role, being sort of non-affiliated or not an active actor in the conflict before. When it comes to Central Asia in that sense, I think any influence or contact there would go through Russia. So if some of the Chinese interest in that region was to collide with Russian regional interests, that would take priority in that dynamic there. When we look at AUKUS or the refocusing of the global north on Indo-Pacific, I think the role for China anchors on Argentina. The Western coast is pretty much aligned now, and now I'm talking the South American subcontinent, is pretty much aligned with the US or AUKUS powers at this point now. And what we heard earlier, what we can see with some defense procurement contracts also, is that there are warming ties between Buenos Aires and Beijing, which possibly also has to do with the rivalry regionally between two neighboring countries there, which is Chile and Argentina, taking very different approaches to China, but also to the whole Indo-Pacific debate currently and AUKUS. Let's also not forget that the issue of Las Malvinas finds support in Beijing, whereas it would not find support in AUKUS.
Jorge, I would like to say something about your question regarding Central Asia and Afghanistan. I think what's happening right now is like the huge test for China, because as you probably know, Afghanistan is called the graveyard of the great powers. So the English failed there, the Soviets failed there, the Americans failed there, just retreated. And we know the Taliban have some support from China. So I think China now has to prove, okay, the way I do things is the way things should be done. Look, everybody failed, but I did it. So I think that what happens in the next few years with Afghanistan and China is going to be like groundbreaking, because it's going to be like everybody failed, the graveyard of great powers, but I did it. So that's what I think is so important.
Thanks, Elena. Thanks, everyone.
Well, if I could just tag on to what Elena and Simon and Coronado were talking about. Unfortunately, I know Afghanistan far better than I know Texas these days because I spent a lot of time there, 5 years in a row, part of each year in Afghanistan, all over, dealing with the Taliban and others in the counterterrorism world. I think what China does not understand, and one of the fatal flaws of their strategy, is they don't care about culture of other folks. They just don't. It's not in the cards for them. So they will never bother to learn, and they're already learning the hard lessons of this in northern Pakistan, that you have to make accommodations. You have to work with people equitably, or you're going to eventually end up with somebody that shoots back at you. That will be Afghanistan. And to make matters worse for them, in Central Asia, they're competing with Russia and India. The thing is, and this goes to everybody's interest here, is if collective response for a rules-based order is the answer to an aggressive China or any other great power, then the target, the initial target of that collective effort needs to be on infrastructure. Because, for example, in Argentina has a long, very compatible history with Japan. They lent them military vessels in the early 1900s against Russia. And just, there's a really good bond there. And I think with Japan dedicating $400 million, probably more, towards infrastructure development, I think there's a more than fair chance that Argentina weans themselves from Chinese money and ends up accepting Japanese money in the long run. And I think that would be better for Argentina if they could funnel both of those funding streams into what their needs are, not just, let's not pick a side. Southeast Asia, almost all nations say the same thing, whether in public or in private. Please don't make us pick sides. We live in this neighborhood. And so that's an issue. So the only answer to all these issues are more effective collaborative efforts around the world in pursuit of ethical commerce, ethical governance, ethical security. In Afghanistan, it would take us weeks and weeks and weeks to peel back all the layers of the onion in Afghanistan. Right now, China can't even manage CPEC because they have Baluchs in the south that have long-standing grievances with Islamabad. They have their own Taliban, which the ISI, the intelligence community in Pakistan, their lead community who essentially runs Pakistan, they have long influence with the Pakistani Taliban, who are literally supporting, including with airlift, Afghan Taliban. So what China is looking to do with Taliban cooperation is to reach out and mitigate the extremists in the north that will jeopardize the CPEC. China doesn't have a clue about counterterrorism. The one danger there is it will contribute to worse human rights abuses than we see with the Uyghurs now in Western China. Because if China and Pakistan throw in on the Taliban side, nobody will care about the Uyghurs anymore at all. So we'll have 1 million to 2 million people that will languish along with other religious entities in Chinese prisons. And China, they will wield leverage, economic leverage. They've already bought off the Middle East. Nobody's going to come to the rescue of the Uyghurs. Nobody in the Muslim community. So China's playing only for them. Anywhere they can find leverage, they will apply it to their specific needs. Will it make a lot of people happy and dead? Unfortunately, it will. I hope that wasn't too blunt.
Thank you. Coronado, do you want to add something?
Yes, because I agree completely. The Chinese are non-empathic at all about cultures, religions, or whatsoever. But there's a key idea which is really important for them, is to keep the borders as the empire they feel they are. And those are the old borders and the old lines of the Chinese Han Empire. So the problem with Afghanistan is just having the Uyghur problem connected with the Taliban, and they will pay whatever to keep that peacefully. But it's just pragmatism and non-empathism, let's say. This pragmatic approach is very important to understand the Chinese mentality. What is good for China, what is good for the Communist Party to stay in power, because there's a sort of agreement between the party and the Chinese people. I'll keep you comfortable, I keep you fed, well-fed, you can travel around the world if you want, you can even be rich if you do not put me very nervous, let's say, but do not touch my borders, do not touch my economic politics, and do not touch my strategy. As long as you accept that, it will work.
Thank you, Corinna. Elena, then Simon.
Thank
Elena,
you.
you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add something to Paul.
Yes.
Paul, you served for the U.S. Army, right? I grew up in the U.S. I was actually in New York when 9/11 happened, so I know the meaning of all of this. So I have a very specific question for you. I said the Soviets failed, the Soviets failed, the English failed, everyone has failed in Afghanistan. So from your U.S. Army perspective, what are the chances that the Chinese said, okay, this was a mess, and we're the ones that managed to handle it correctly? And what do the U.S. will think about it? Because I was there when it happened. So what's your take on that?
Well, see, let me make sure I understand the question correctly. So what you're asking is, why did the Chinese think that they can succeed where everybody else did?
Yeah, what do you think, from a U.S. perspective, do you think like it's actually going to happen? Like the Soviets fail, the Europeans fail, the English fail, the Soviets fail. Are the Chinese going to make it to get a hold of Afghanistan? And what implications would that have for the U.S.?
Well, first of all, it's very important to understand that the Chinese approach is going to be completely different than the Soviet approach. Just to correct one minor, see, narrative is not always about truth, it's about meaning. So there's the perception that it's a graveyard of empires is mostly accurate in modern times, but the British did have a period where they succeeded after two very, very painful wars that they had succeeded not at all. I mean, complete failures. But they finally figured out something that the Chinese are tagging onto. Do not occupy the country, just find the power brokers that you're willing to back and let them do your dirty work for you, which is exactly the tributary system that goes back at least 2,000 years. So China will not, I don't see them occupying. I see them putting enough people there militarily to work with the Afghans and apparently also the Pakistanis, but I don't see them going in there, putting their feet on the ground and annoying people. The odd thing is also China has a very intimate historical relationship with the center of Afghanistan, where the Hazara inhabit, who are the only major Shia population there. So the Chinese is, I mean, the province where the Hazara are dominant is also where the giant Buddhas were, which was a transplant from between India to China and China back to Afghanistan, which was part of India at the time, or one of the kingdoms. So they have a relationship, but they will not stick up for the Hazara because that's where all the rare earth minerals are. So they will support any Taliban abuse of the traditionally downtrodden and abused Hazara population in order to get the rare earth minerals. It was a good question, a great question actually. But the U.S., we didn't get it there. Yeah. We did not get it there at all, and we failed.
But
because
Paul,
we did. Yeah.
One last thing. I'm asking you this question because actually I think the role that China has in Afghanistan, like after the U.S. retreated, is actually a change of narrative. Like we have the hard power narrative that the Soviets, the Americans had. Now China is getting in, but I think it has a complete new narrative, like more towards soft power. influence, cooperation. What do you think about this?
Guys,
I agree
we're going to have to
completely
wrap
that
it up. Sorry,
Yeah,
we're going to have
sorry.
to wrap it up very, very soon. So if Paul, you could give like a very short answer, then we'll have a final word from Simon, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
It's a great question, but I can't make it a short answer. Elena, it's a great question. It's really a great question. Hold on to it. I'll reach out to me then.
Okay, we can discuss later. No rush, but I really want to
Simon,
discuss this with you.
Simon, you wanted
Yes,
to add something?
I just wanted to add to what Paul and Coronado were saying in terms of pragmatism in the approach to Taliban and Afghanistan. I was speaking earlier about this insistence on the PRC part on absolute sovereignty, that within its own territory, a nation or a polity is absolutely sovereign. There's not to be any interference. And I think this will be, in a pragmatic way, the same approach the PRC or the government in Beijing is taking now towards the Taliban, simply to remain on a pragmatic level, to not change political order in Afghanistan, but to be pragmatic about commercial flows, economic flows, and ultimately extraction also of resources. If the Taliban are a partner that China can see going forward with, they will do that without interfering with the local system of order that is currently reconstructing or developing in a different way now. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks a lot. Jorge, I think we have to wrap it up here. So I don't know if you have a final word before we end it.
Well, I can very sincerely thank you all, not only for accepting our invitation, but also for the fruitful talk we have had. It seems that we will have to organize another webinar in the future because there are plenty of questions that need to be answered, or at least to go deeper. But again, thank you so much. I think that it has been a great joint effort to conduct this webinar amongst our institutions. So I really look forward to continuing working with you all in the future. Thank you so much.
Well, and thank you, Jorge, and thank you to UCA and to our four speakers, Coronada, Elena, Paul, and Simon. Thanks a lot for the quality presentations and the very engaging and stimulating exchanges. We will be organizing in the future some similar events. So we'll be hoping to see you all on those events. And I think on those words, I would like to thank everyone, all the participants, and wish you a very good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.